The world of French politics was thrown into turmoil today as the long-awaited verdict in the trial of far-right leader Marine Le Pen arrived, and it was the most extreme outcome that almost all politicians and media commentators had believed highly unlikely. And the effects of it is that Le Pen, who has consistently in recent polling been the front-runner for the next presidential election to be held in 2027, she is barred from standing for office for 5 years. So let's have a look at this. First, some context. Since her father, Jean-Marie Le Pen, was the central figure for what was then the National Front, the name Le Pen has haunted mainstream French politicians. Jean-Marie was the archetypal toxic far-right politician whose hand should never be allowed anywhere near the levers of power. Someone who, for example, downplayed the Holocaust and was fined for incitement to racial hatred. The French version of numerous other parties with whom no one would collaborate, no one would ever endorse or give any form of recognition. But over the last decade, his daughter Marine had, with one eye on the successful party rehabilitation represented by Giorgia Meloni's success in Italy, been engaged on the slow job of detoxifying her party, to the degree where her father had denounced her. The party's name had been changed to distance itself from the version of the past, and given Emmanuel Macron's deep unpopularity and the hollowing out of the centre in French politics generally, the strategy had been slowly bearing fruit over the years. So Le Pen had come second to Macron last time, and since then Macron's approval ratings had sunk out of sight. Now, while there's never anything certain in politics, certainly it seemed increasingly likely that 2027 might be the year when she would finally break through. But she and a number of other MPs from her party were on trial for embezzlement, which sounds a bit worse than it was, since we associate the term embezzlement with stealing for personal gain. What happened was that her party took money paid to its members of the European Parliament, who get funds for the purposes of staffing and other expenses, and diverted it to central party operations in France. So no, the individuals were not enriched from that money. The organisation took it as income when it needed it at a time when party funds were thin on the ground. The party was in some financial distress. Saying that it wasn't about personal corruption doesn't stop it from being illegal. It remains European taxpayer funds, though, are being spent for purposes unrelated to work being carried out for the European Parliament. And the court proceedings where, for example, internal emails were disclosed amongst other evidence, left little doubt that the charges were completely soundly based. The party had hired 4 fictitious European Parliament assistants who in reality worked for the party at home, carrying out work unrelated to the EU. Marine Le Pen was party president at the time and was said to have played a central role in the system, so it was widely expected that she would be found guilty today. But it was also widely expected that she would get a serious but limited penalty. If there was to be any impact at all on the presidential election in 2 years' time, it would come from the knowledge that she had been found guilty of such a crime, which, given her public positioning as an anti-corruption crusader, might have damaged her. That said, it wasn't hugely expected that it would make that much difference. Most of the French parties have been accused of infringements of various sorts over recent years. The French people are pretty philosophical about it. However, a frisson was added to proceedings back in November last year when the French State Prosecutor requested an extremely harsh sentence. Not just jail time, but also to bar her from running from office for a 5-year period. And the key detail was that, unlike usual custom, where such a disbarment would be suspended from coming into effect until after the appeal process had run its course, In this case, the request was for the ban to come into effect immediately. And that is exactly what the judge decided to hand down as the penalty once the verdict was confirmed today. And that single decision, which can't now be reversed or revoked before the election takes place, unless the appeal happens a lot more quickly than it ever usually does in the French courts, that has taken Le Pen out of contention. Le Pen's allies, as you would expect, but also many mainstream politicians, have expressed themselves to be dismayed at this as an outcome. The spectacle of the front runner for the next presidential election being taken out in this way, it screams of a denial of democracy. It should be down to the electorate, the argument goes, who gets voted in as president, not down to an individual judge choosing to go for the most extreme penalty for what seemed to be predominantly political reasons. Of course, the MAGA right on Twitter and Elon Musk himself, as if you would ever have doubted it, have been quick to join Le Pen's home supporters in denouncing the charges as trumped up, the whole thing as an example of political elites using undemocratic means to prevent themselves from losing power. And that is precisely the argument that those aforementioned mainstream politicians bemoaning the result have sought not to provide fuel for. For example, speaking before he was appointed as Justice Minister, Gérard Darmanin said it would be deeply shocking if Marine Le Pen were found to be ineligible, i.e. barred from standing. And yet, here we are. The surreal moment came when Russia's Dmitry Peskov said this: more and more European capitals are going down the path of violating democratic norms. Yeah, Dmitry Peskov never once met a democratic norm he didn't want to throw out of a fifth-floor window. But these are the people now posing for selfies on the moral high ground. The counter-argument is that, look, the charges were real. She and her colleagues committed the crimes. Nobody should presume that they're above the law. That's the argument, of course. It is an argument that seems weak compared to the unexpected severity of the outcome, which had not been something looked to for most of the political establishment. And yet you can say it was the state prosecutor who demanded the penalty, so it's hard to argue the establishment had no hand in it whatsoever. So the question is, what happens now? The obvious, some are saying inevitable successor for the 2027 election is Le Pen's second in command, Jordan Bardella. He had been positioned as the preferred prime minister to serve Le Pen when she became president. However, party politics can be brutal. Partisan activists can get distracted at the times when you might argue they can least afford to be. So it's worth at least noting that Bardella is seen as more identitarian and liberal than his boss was, and possibly more disadvantaged by his relative youth, bearing in mind that when a formerly unmovable leader is suddenly taken out the way, it can unleash all sorts of pent-up ambitions and rivalries. He certainly won't be able to take it for granted that he is simply coronated as the new standard bearer. In principle, it most likely comes down to Le Pen's choice. In practice, the party was not expecting this outcome, hadn't prepared for it. That could well be the circumstance that leads it into a moment of self-indulgence. But in any case, can a replacement candidate for Le Pen expect to do as well in the polls as she would have done? Is it so transferable as that? Will the party benefit from a sympathy vote boost based on the perception of political dirty dealing that some will no doubt see in this result? Right now, it's hard to know, politics being unpredictable as it is. The key issue for France is that its political centre remains a wasteland and people are more inclined to vote for a somewhat, but how much unknown, but somewhat detoxified far right than they would an unreconstructed far left. But this is a moment of political peril for France that could overshadow the next couple of years. Highly likely, that in the future we will be pointing to this moment on this day as a key pivot point in a powerful political case study. It's just that right now we don't know what it will be a case study actually of.